What's going on, guys? And welcome back. Yes, I said back because this is episode 2 of the MMA Archive. Man, feels so good to say that. I'm excited to come here and talk to you guys about UFC 2. No Way Out is the name of the event. Um, this one was crazy. I mean, all of these are crazy. Like, I'm going to be real. There's always something to talk about with all these fights. So, um, let's get right into it, man. This one is called No Way Out. They actually changed the rules for this one. I know that they're infamous for no rules, but there was, if you remember, 5-minute rounds in the first UFC event. But the second UFC event, they made it so it's a unlimited, no time limit fight. So it's one round only, no time limit, and they changed the rules back to primal, like literally primal. They made it so that groin strikes are allowed, which I I don't agree with, to be honest. And the biggest one that I hate to see, well, we'll get to that later, but the biggest one that they changed is that referees cannot stop the fight, that it's only up to the corner and the participants themselves to either submit by tapping out, even if it's to strikes, or for the corner to throw in the towel. And whew, it comes to bite them. It comes to bite them a couple times in this event. Crazy stuff, man. I'm excited to get into it. Let's get right into it. This one is taking place on March 11th, which is interesting because it's another year from removed from the previous event, but it's only been 5 months. So 5 months later, after the first tournament, they're doing another tournament, and instead of an 8-man tournament, this time it's actually a 16-man tournament, single elimination. So you lose once, you're out of the entire tournament, and it's just wild the fact that they got 16 people to compete, as well as bringing back some people from the first UFC event, which we'll get to a little bit later. Um, but here's the rest of the stats, I guess, the rest of the information that we need to know before we get started. The event took place March 11th, 1994, at the Mammoth Gardens in Denver, Colorado. Once again, the second time they were at elevation, um, where having these fights take place, which is crazy, especially when you see how some of these bouts end up playing out. Fatigue definitely ended up being a factor in a lot of these fights. But the first fight was obviously the debut of the entire event. You got Scott Morris going up against Sean Daughtery. These are two people that haven't competed yet in the UFC. Scott Morris was listed as an exotics fighter, which, being I'm someone from New York, I found this hilarious. A lot of times people refer to like different kinds of weeds as exotics. So when I heard this, I'm like, nah, my man's is exotics. He's different. You feel me? He's built different. But you got Scott Morris with his exotics background against Sean Daughtery, who's representing karate. Um, let's just go right into it. Let's do it. Actually, I forgot to mention this first. You have 3 announcers. This time it's Brian Kilmeade, Jim Brown, and Ben Perry. 2 new people to be around Jim Brown. A lot more technical advice in this one, which I found very interesting. Um, and then just clowning by Brian Kilmeade, just clowning. He's funny. You guys should really check out these fights too alongside this podcast. I really recommend that, whether it's after or before, just really check out what it's like, because I was honestly just trying to take it in as if it was a live event. Like, I feel like whenever you're watching these cards live, there's a big difference in feeling as far as how important the fights are, and I guess the thrill of not knowing what's going to happen. So I try to limit the spoilers for myself too. So maybe you guys could consider doing that too. When as I talk about these fights, you check them out and then you hear what I have to say about them. That's an interesting approach. But anyway, the ring announcer was once again Rich the G-Man Goins. Oh man, you love to see it. It's so strange the way he just repeats people's last names. We'll get to that once again. And then they had a post-fight interview person, Herb Perez, which was doing interviews the whole night, which I found really cool, actually. It added a different layer as far as understanding the personalities that are competing, which I found pretty cool. It adds to the story of everything, which once again, shout out to my boy Dwayne. Story is everything, whether or not it's pro wrestling or anything. Whenever they're trying to sell people on these events, whenever they're trying to explain why this event is important, anything like that, it's always pointing to the fact that there is some storyline. And the big storyline in this tournament is the fact that Hoist Gracie is back and he's defending his title. I'm getting all over the place, though. As you can see, I'm very excited about this event. So let's get back to the first bout. I tried to introduce these guys already. We got Scott Morris going up against Sean Daughtery. This one was interesting. So this one ended super quick, and I actually found this to be a pretty technical fight. Like for what happened in obviously the short amount of time. But the fight started with Sean Daughtery sort of coming out and trying to throw kicks, landed some good kicks as well, I might add, and then Scott Morris just bum rushing him and bringing him in close and clinching range. And immediately Sean Daughtery sort of dipped his head down in that clinch exchange, and just the worst possible thing he could have done. Scott Morris wrapped up his neck and then threw him backwards, like threw the entire momentum, threw both of them backwards, and ended up in a mounted guillotine, which I found really slick. The way he went about the transition, throwing himself, rolling through, and then when he got through, you see he does everything he can to fight the legs and hook the legs so that he's actually in the proper mounted guillotine position before he starts exerting, which I found to be like super technical for someone who technically wasn't trained in jujitsu at this point. Like at this point, it was always Gracie jujitsu is this like mystical thing that not everyone has access to. But that was really slick. Like the instincts were there as far as how he put the hooks in and literally just waited until the proper time to exert that force and get the finish with the mounted guillotine. And it finished quick, man. Only at 20 seconds of the first round, if I'm not mistaken. We just quickly looked through this. This was the fastest fight of the entire night, and it was the very first one. Once again, literally the same thing happened last event, which is crazy. But really cool to see someone else besides a Gracie win by submission. Same way it was with Ken Shamrock. You see, and you're just like instantly, I wonder how this person would do in different scenarios. And we get to see that later, which is even better. Next up, the second bout of the night between Patrick Smith and Ray Wizard. Patrick Smith is representing kickboxing, Ray Wizard representing karate. You might remember this name. Patrick Smith did compete in UFC 1 in the first matchup against Ken Shamrock. This includes, well, once again, if you're here, I hope you watched episode 1, but this includes some spoilers. Obviously, go check out episode 1 if you want to hear that. But Patrick Smith ended up losing in the first round to Ken Shamrock by a heel hook. And I don't know, more of a bootleg leg lock. But anyway, so he's returning and he's in his hometown. So every time he fought, I found this to be so exciting. Like every time he fought, the crowd was entirely behind him, going crazy. And it really added to the sort of build of his fights, if that makes sense. You sort of feel the crowd on his side and you kind of want to root for him too because of it. So this one started fast and furious. Both guys sort of ran up to each other and ended up in a clinch position. I thought this was pretty, once again, you're seeing glimpses at sort of the modern game. And I think one part of this bout that really reminded me of the modern game today is both of these guys were vying for inside position up against the fence. So that they were both doing reversals, or where Patrick Smith was ending up being the one pushing against Ray Wizard, pushing Ray Wizard against the fence rather, and then Ray Wizard reversing and then being the one pushing Patrick Smith up against the fence. And it ended up being entirely to his detriment, which is kind of crazy. Patrick Smith in that transition just grabbed up his neck, and the way this one finished was crazy. I didn't expect it to be that tight because of the position they were in. He was still standing up. He was against the fence. So this finish really reminded me. I'll get back to this in a second. Sorry. Patrick Smith just locked in the choke while he was up against the fence. So he locks in the guillotine. It's entirely extended and ends up getting the tap. But right before he was able to, well, he being the referee, was able to stop the fight. Um, you see, literally, Ray Wizard is out, like out cold. And when Patrick Smith lets him go, when the ref stops the fight because of the tap, Ray Wizard just falls to the ground, and you see him sort of convulse. And I know that that's a really scary thing to hear. Um, People that have grappled, I'm someone who has trained very, very briefly, I might add. I need to train again, want to get in some good shape. I mean, I love talking about it, so I got to get to training more. But um, people that have trained know that sometimes when people get choked out, it can lead to sort of involuntary or what your body thinks is reactive movements. And you see Ray Wizard really shaking there and trying to, like, almost like he's fighting, like trying to throw punches. And then eventually he comes to and realizes sort of that he got choked out. And it's so crazy because they were doing the post-fight interviews and they'll just start letting people the person that lost, they'll let them leave, like, don't get me wrong, and you'll see it the whole time. So they'll be talking to the fighter that won, and you'll see the person like coming to and then eventually leaving and walking out of the cage, which is just bizarre. Like, I don't think in today's UFC you really see moments like that. Like, they show things like that, don't get me wrong, they show updates when people are out and things like that, but you don't really see that at the same time as far as somebody talking, and then you just see like the thrill and the agony, I suppose, um where Patrick Smith is celebrating, and you see Ray Wizard and his team sort of trying to get his bearings right and get him out of the cage. I really like this fight. It only took 58 seconds for Patrick Smith to lock up this choke, but it was really technical while it lasted. Let me get a sip of water. All right. Something that I might add, I forgot to mention this in the beginning of this event, but the sole referee of this entire night was Big John McCarthy, making his UFC debut, which is crazy to think about now. He's now a commentator for Bellator and does no longer referee fights, but so many classic fights have been refereed by him. So it's really cool to see his sort of origin. He looks so young, and he does a great job with the cards he's dealt. I think the fact that he wasn't allowed to stop fights really, you could tell, bothered him, and I've heard him talk about that as well, in referencing this event and his debut. As far as, like, he said, if I'm gonna do this again, like, I need to be able to stop the fight, and I agree, because later on we're gonna get to some crazy, insane, and frankly uncomfortable stuff, which I understand why at the time a lot of people were calling for this to be banned. I don't agree with that. Obviously, I'm a huge fan, and I always advocate for these athletes, no matter what, because yeah, it's a brutal, barbaric sport, but at the end of the day, it's a true expression of combat. I know that sounds cliche and corny, but um, I'm not trying to say this is as close as you get to a street fight, because I hate when people say that. It's kind of silly, but what it really is it allows everybody, regardless of how they train, and especially you'll see this at this time, whether they're grapplers, whether they're strikers, to put their talents to the test and really see what works, and who can apply their game against someone else who's trying to do the exact same thing. Nowadays, it's not really that simple. You have so many layers in every mixed martial arts bout as far as preparation and what people are prepared to do. Here, people were just prepared for the most part in one sort of discipline. So it really changes the way these fights look. So keep that in mind as we go throughout the event. But anyway, I got off a little tangent right there. Next up, our third bout of the night, we had Johnny Rhodes representing karate coming up against David Levicki. I hope I pronounced that right. Um, Johnny Rhodes is kind of a unsung hero in this event, and you'll see more of that as we continue once again. But this one was a grueling fight, man. Johnny Rhodes was the smaller man in this one. Levicki was 6'5" and a Navy SEALs trained forces guy. They were hyping that up in the broadcast. Really quickly to mention, I feel like something that's really interesting about this event too is you'll see that the announcers are pretty not biased, but they sort of lay it out there on their hearts on their sleeve as far as who they think is going to win and how they think is going to happen. So they just sort of they just sort of I think this person's going to win and the other person probably doesn't even have a chance. So it's funny whenever things get sort of flung on its head, and they were looking at Levicki as a favorite in this one. But a little bit of a spoiler there. But anyway, this one begins in a wild sort of scramble. Um, it ends up with Rhodes sort of shooting for a takedown, Levicki getting a reversal, and then eventually ending up on bottom position, which was just the worst thing that could have happened. Um, and literally for the rest of this fight, this was the longest fight of the night. It went for 12 minutes and 13 seconds. Johnny Rhodes was on top. Um, whether it be in guard, which he was for the most, I would say the majority of this 12 minutes, he was in Levicki's full guard. But man, this is a mess. Like this was a mess. This is why I think they should never ever implement no time limits or no round breaks or no like unlimited just fighting until someone wins. Cause man, this got ugly and fast. And the funniest part about this whole fight is like Johnny Rhodes was on top in that full guard position, and as Levicki's trying to sort of create leverage with his legs, he's sort of pulling down on Johnny Rhodes' gi pants. So we end up in a situation where you're 4 minutes into this, to be frank, slog where Johnny Rhodes is on top trying to land pot shots, land punches, but not really doing much of anything, not really advancing his position or trying to move towards any sort of submission. No, just staying in that position, trying to land punches and not give up that position. And literally, Johnny Rhodes' ass is out. Like, I'm just going to say it. His whole ass is out. And then John McCarthy is coming behind him and picking up his pants and just giving him a wedgie mid fight. So he has to deal with competition and being wedgie by the ref. Like, this fight, it was so funny to me because of that. Like, I just couldn't believe what I was watching. Like, it was just a real, literal shit show. Like, man, I found this one so funny. But eventually, you see Johnny Rhodes sort of end up in a position where he has Levicki against the fence, and he did something really interesting, which I picked up on, and I sort of like to be aware of these things to see how they're trying to win. And Johnny Rhodes sort of had him in a can opener position, which is where you have the arm sort of on their, I guess, clavicle areas, and he was grabbing the fence through that. So his hands were pushing up against his opponent, but he was holding the fence on the other side so he could hold that position. Which obviously wasn't illegal at this time. It's illegal as hell now. You can't grab the fence at all. They say you could tap, but you can't grab, which is you see it all the time anyway, which the art of Dundasso. Shout out to the co-main event podcast, but just literally most of the time in modern MMA, you'll get away with a couple fouls just because they're willing to go out there and say, this is your warning. You've been warned, even though technically you're warned in the back, which I don't agree with. But either way, you see that now to a certain extent. Obviously, they're skirting the lines. They're trying to, if someone's grabbing the cage in modern MMA, they're trying to hide it. They're not trying to be blatant about it. Johnny Rose was just holding him there with the cage. and just landing shots. And eventually, the replay showed he landed a nice crisp punch to his eye that cut him. And then you see David Levicki. Obviously, he's poor guy's been stuck in this position the whole fight. Couldn't really do anything to get out of it. Wasn't really taking a severe beating, but those punches really add up, especially over 12 minutes. And eventually, towards the end, he got really cut up bad, and he's just leaking in his eye, like it was coming down into the eye. And because of the way he's like laying down on the floor, it started pooling. So you just see a lot of blood in the eye orbital, like socket, just not a good visual. And then you obviously see after the fight just a huge, looked like someone poured out a bottle of wine in that area of the cage. Um, but ended up being a pretty brutal finish because of it, like the optics of it. The punches to me didn't seem to be too hard, but David Levicki eventually tapped out from what I could only imagine is being blinded by his own blood. Which is crazy to think because now in MMA they get put in a position like that where they're bleeding that much, and even if they're on the ground, they'll immediately stop it, bring the doctor in, let them see if the cut is bad enough that they would consider stopping it, or they just wipe it off and then put them back in that same position, which can be a little dicey. I mean, you're changing the flow of the fight, and ideally you don't want to do that. But this fight was interesting. Um, Boring as hell. I'm gonna be honest, boring as hell. But definitely, I mean, David Levicki's a tough guy to withstand when he withstand it, but it was just kind of strange to see. Not like he wasn't trying, but there was nothing he could do, like to get himself out of that position, which in today's MMA just makes no sense. Like, so that's what made this extra boring to me. Like, it's just you don't see things like this, which made it to be an interesting fight for me. But Johnny Rhodes win via submission due to strikes at 12-13, the longest fight of the night. Once again, I'm not saying go back and watch this if you're not a diehard like me that would want to see how this unplays, but um, not the most exciting fight. But hey, maybe you can skip to the end and catch the finish for sure. Next up, Frank Hamacher, which is a grappler, is coming up against Thaddeus Luster, which is a kung fu fighter. Um, Once again, these are so funny the way they named them. They did say the actual sort of disciplines throughout that the broadcast, but I found it very hard for me to keep note of that. So I'm gonna let you guys hear that if you're gonna watch the event. I'm just gonna put up the what they actually put up on the graphic, which is once again grappler versus kung fu, which I find hilarious. The mystical kung fu. But Frank Hamacher is actually somebody who was in Gerard Gordeau's corner, which is once again the finalist from the first UFC event. And you see Gerard Gordeau actually in his corner for these fights, which I found super interesting. Just sort of keep an eye on these things and seeing obviously both events in succession of each other. You sort of notice these things, which I found pretty cool. They were also in the corner of another fighter we're gonna get to later, but just sort of making their own fight team out there, and I will admit doing their thing. So Frank Hamaker's a bigger dude. Definitely not a cut up guy, little on the pudgy side, but definitely you can see he knows what he's doing when it comes to grappling. And this one immediately turned into a grappling contest. You can see Thaddeus Luster. He had a really cool look to him. I'll admit it. He had the spats on, which is basically leggings, and he had his black belt over the top of it, which was a very interesting look to say the least. And Frank Hamacher had a singlet on, dude. He came ready to wrestle. If you see a dude in a singlet, you already know you better be ready to sprawl because my boy's coming to take you down. You feel me? Just, I mean, definitely what you would expect as far as how the fight played out. Frank Hamacher eventually ended up getting on top and then sort of losing position, and then you see a really cool transition, which I wanted to point out, where Frank Hamacher sort of ends up in a spot where he has to dump him again, and he literally dumps him like a fireman's carry. Like he throws him over and ends up back on top position, which I was like, that takes a lot of strength to do, especially with someone that's not on the floor already. It's not easy to do, but he did it very flawlessly as far as he executed the toss. So that was cool to see. Give me 1 second. So this one got a little on the technical side as far as how I'm going to try to explain the finish. But Frank Hamacher ended a position where he's sort of in mount and is attacking a key lock, which is where, and it wasn't even really a key lock the way he was attacking it, but it's where you sort of hold your opponent's wrist to the mat and then you're sort of trying to, how do I don't really know how to explain it to you without it's one of the more technical moves, but sort of you're trying to leverage their shoulder blade by keeping their wrist on the mat and sort of pudging out their elbow and trying to do damage to that shoulder. It's a very strange submission because if you know how to um if you know what your opponent is going for and you've felt it before, it's relatively easy to keep yourself out of that position. But it is very painful. I will admit when I first got put in a key lock, it's not something that you ever felt before, like that pain on your shoulder. It's very weird, and it's not on the front; it's in the back, like on the back part of the shoulder. It's a very it's painful. It's a very weird pain as well because, like I said, you've never really felt anything like that before. Even if like you're holding long stretches, you don't feel that sort of tension in that part of the shoulder blade, especially. So it's very anyway, very niche submission, and he worked to get it, but eventually his corner kind of just stopped it, which I always hate to see. If I'm being honest, yeah, he was landing a couple of unanswered shots while defending that position, but he didn't look particularly in trouble. Um, and he was trying, that's something. But do I think he was going to get out of that position ultimately? No. So I can't really complain too much. But I just found this fight pretty interesting for that fact. I mean, modern moves that do not get, for the most part, I have not seen any, not that I recall. I've seen attempts, but I haven't seen anybody hit a key lock in a match before in the UFC or in any other MMA promotion for that matter. So it was interesting to see him attack that. In my opinion, he didn't really get it still because obviously he didn't get the tap, but a win's a win and it's via submission. He did what he had to do and he moves on to the next round. So the coolest part about this for me when watching this is you're following the tournament. So you're seeing who wins and you're seeing like potentially who could be the person that's going to face Hoist, the champ from UFC 1. And there's a lot of good options already. I mean, you got two really quick submissions in the first two fights and then two more submissions, but they were a little more drawn out. One of them to strikes and then another to a corner stoppage. All very different. Um, None of these fights are the same just because they're won by submission. Just very, like I said, very, very broad spectrum of bouts so far and just different body compositions that you'll see or different techniques that you'll see and you wonder like can they get this technique to work against the Gracie? Can he potentially land strikes or even put himself in a position to get a choke against Hoist? Like at this point, people look at you like you're crazy if you even insinuated that would happen to Hoist. But I'm taking it as it is. I once again I try to avoid spoilers when I'm watching. So up to this point, I'm like, these four guys all won by submission. I will want to see all of them potentially fight Hoist. So I just like the way the event sort of builds in that way. And it's a little strange. I actually had to seek these preliminary bouts, the first round of the tournament, the first 8 fights, basically, they were hard to find. Like I had to seek them out individually, the individual fights, and then watch them in that order. So of course, I ended up having to go to Sherdog. Shout out to Sherdog for having Sherdog, Tapology, all of these amazing sources as far as MMA history. They have all the information you need, and I sort of pull it up and I try to stay as close as I can to the bottom, so I'm not seeing the results of the fights that I haven't seen yet. Um, and I'll just go up that way, and I'll scroll up after each fight, and then I'll see the way they have it listed, and that's how I get these times and everything. So shout out to Tapology and Sherdog for being reliable sources in that way. But just really, like I said, really cool stuff in these first 4 fights. On to the 5th. We'll get comfortable here. All right. On to the 5th bout. We've got Orlando Veet coming up against Robert Lucarelli. This this one was fucking crazy, bro. Like this was one of my favorite fights of the entire night. Orlando Veet is a Muay Thai kickboxer, which I was really excited to see when he was in the introductions, like how this would work. Because a lot of striking techniques now are based in Muay Thai striking, or what they like to call, striking today. A lot of it derives from Muay Thai and not karate techniques. As far as throwing elbows, throwing knees, and the way you throw certain kicks, as far as push kicks, etc. So it was just interesting to see the fact that we have a Muay Thai fighter so early on, sort of representing his fighting style. I don't know why it took me that was escaping me, but representing Thai boxing against a traditional kickboxer. So they said that Lucarelli has some wrestling experience. In my opinion, he was one of the guys of this entire tournament that when you saw them, it felt a little like woo-woo martial artsy. Like, whoa, like are you sure you could really like compete? Like, he was a pudgy guy, more so than even Frank Hamacher was. And not in a good way, like not that he's big and imposing, but like in a like you're kind of flabbing around. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big dude. I can't talk too much shit. I'm not here talking shit. I'm just saying, as far as like an athlete, when you're seeing this, it's like I don't know as far as how well he's gonna be able to do. And then you look across at Orlando Veet, and this guy is jacked. Like the commentary was super hype to talk about him. Like they were like, wow, this is the best built man I've ever seen, and just hyping him up, which I found very funny, because like I said, they just wore their hearts on their sleeve the whole night and were just saying whatever they felt, which I found pretty cool, man. Like, think about it, they in a lot of ways nobody's seen some shit like this before, so they're just being authentic and reacting. And now, as it's sort of looked at as obviously a sport and regulated that way, um you don't have that. You have the commentaries being very trying to call it down the line as best as they can and sort of give each fighter their due. And in a lot of ways, they were just on Orlando Veet's side and just saying, I don't know how Lucarelli's going to survive this. Got my little mute button going. I'm ready. I don't want y'all to hear too much of me drinking. But this one started fast and furious and kind of crazy. So um Lucarelli is sort of bum rushing him as Orlando Veet's trying to keep his distance and land some leg kicks, some chopping kicks. Eventually, Lucarelli sort of bum rushes him and ends up in a position where he has not his back, but he ends up behind him and starts to pursue a choke. Um, Orlando Veet obviously has the choke locked in on him, but he's holding his opponent's head and grabbing his hair literally, um, as he's trying to choke him, and sort of just pulling against it, try to make a little fulcrum to give himself some room to breathe. And eventually he's able to sneak out the back door, from the way that he was attacking the choke and sort of scramble up to his feet. And as he's scrambling up to his feet, this is obviously his wheelhouse now. Lucarelli is on his knees and sort of trying to grab at Veet to try to take him back down, I would presume. And man, Veet grabs his head and just blasts him with a knee that was just, I was like, ooh, like, call the cops, bro, because damn, like, I know that shit hurt. Like, I know just from the way it landed that he felt that shit and he immediately dropped and then tried to get up, and then he literally threw a soccer kick, boom, and kicked him again in the head. And you see him, he's just all fucked up. And shout out to Lucarelli, because this guy just kept on trying to get up, but Orlando V was just sizing him up and had him so hurt that he was just sort of like tumbling in the wind out there. And every time he'll try to get up, he'll end up falling back down. And eventually he sort of ends up turning away, not trying to run away, but trying to like catch his footing, but not being able to because the equilibrium is off. And Orlando Veet is just following him, savage, just following him and throwing downward elbows whenever he can, like to the back of his head. And this is stuff you don't see today. This is stuff that is illegal today. So it's always pretty bizarre whenever something like this happens in one of these fights. I'm just like cringing, like, oh, it's illegal for a reason, you know? And it's like literally to the what it would look like the spinal column, like throwing those elbows right there to the back of the neck. It's brutal stuff. And eventually, as soon as he started landing those shots, that's when the corner threw in the towel. And this was the first example of the night where, yeah, there was longer fights earlier in the night, but they ended by submission. This is the first example where you're like, fuck, man, like they should have stopped this before it got this bad. Like after the knee, you could have stopped it. And there was a prolonged beating after that. So I'm just like, man, I again, you hate to say it. I realize I feel like I've been saying it a lot whenever I'm talking about these fights, but it's just it feels so appropriate to say, like, just a brutal finish and not something that you would see today at all. Um, but I was very impressed. I was like, I want to see him against Hoist because like you don't see stuff like that. Especially at this time, like you just see as far as striking, he looks entirely advanced compared to anyone we've really seen up to this point, in my opinion. So I was really excited seeing this one. I was like, this is going to be interesting. But anyway, on to the next one. You got Hemko Pardo. I'm probably saying that incorrectly. That's not how he said it, but I can't even try to say it the way he did. So watch it if you want to show some respect to the man's name. But he's facing Alberto Caraleon, gangsta, representing exotics once again, which I find hilarious. He was one of the few people who also came out in a gi. So both of these guys are in a gi at the start of this match, which I find hilarious. And Alberto Caraleon was the only one, at least that I saw in the first two events, that came out in a black gi. So my boy was swagged out. I'm not gonna lie, he was looking fly, but it's not gonna really do much for you in the fight. But just funny that they had that sort of difference in visual. One of them has the black gi, one of them has the white gi. Pardo was definitely the bigger man in this matchup. But exciting stuff, man. They're circling around each other at the start of the fight, and you see Alberto sort of doing the hand stuff, like little. When I see stuff like this, I really think more so as like the woo woo martial arts. Like, what are you really doing stuff like that? But he surprised me, like immediately surprised me, because he's doing all this hand distracting stuff and trying to like make it look like he's trying to distract him or something. And then he landed a straight right that cracked Remco, that really sort of turned him around almost. and not sent them running, but he literally faced the opposite way after he got hit by that shot, in like a reaction, like, oh, like, and in that moment, Alberto ended up sort of attacking him and jumping on him and trying to grab his back to sort of attack a choke, I would imagine. But ended up falling off to the side, and now you got this grappler on top of you. You ended up in sort of a prolonged exchange. This is the first fight where there was some back and forth as far as some life on the ground. You see Alberto trying to make reversals at some points, getting to better positions, but eventually Hemko was able to reestablish dominance and end up either in side control or in a sort of scarf hold position, which is common in judo, which they mentioned that he does judo and jujitsu. But really, it was a really drawn out fight, and it ended with a sort of, I called it an Ezekiel choke. It was listed as a rear naked, but it couldn't have been because he was facing him, so it couldn't have been a rear naked just by the way he sort of set it up. I called it an Ezekiel because the arms were on top once again, and then you see him sort of pushing into him um, with it. So I thought it was an Ezekiel choke. Very reminiscent once again, just of a judo move. And it took a little while for him to submit to it. So, excuse me, sorry about that. It took him a little while to end up being submitted by it, but um, this it wasn't a good fight. I'll be honest, but there was some surprising moments, and definitely that finishing sequence was pretty cool to see. So once again, we got another player. It isn't saying much to say all these fights are finished because literally you have to finish the fight in order to win. But some pretty cool submissions and one knockout up to this point. And we're already 6 fights deep. Next up was Jason Deluca versus Scott Baker. Jason Deluca actually also competed in UFC 1. He was in the alternate bout, which took place right before the main event to give the main event fighters some time to be ready to compete after they were fighting earlier in the night. So I was hyped to see him fight again because he had a good performance in that one as well. If you guys remember, he was able to finish the choke with a rear naked at the end, and when he locked it up, he ended up locking it up really quick. So this one was actually very surprising. Um, what can I say? This one was a really back and forth fight. A lot of scrambles, which I found super interesting to watch. Once again, at this point, up to this point, there hasn't really been a lot of back and forth or resistance from these fighters. So you can see on both sides, these guys are sort of working towards positions and they know what they're working towards, which is refreshing to see. It feels like a fight at that point. It doesn't feel like just a one way traffic. This was the first fight, in my opinion, at all that was relatively competitive. Like obviously in the other ones, there were some moments where you don't really know which way it's going to go, but once it starts snowballing, you know who's going to win. This was the first fight that I'm midway through the round, and I'm like, I couldn't really tell you up to this point who I think is just going to win just based off of what happened so far, which I found really cool. There was some real slick submission attempts by both guys. Um, Almost had Jason DeLuca in a choke at one point, and then DeLuca ended up getting out. DeLuca almost had him in a triangle at multiple positions of this fight. Um, there was at least 3 times that I was watching, I was like, that looks kind of tight. Like he's getting towards that point where you're cutting off the circulation. Because once again, that's what triangle chokes are doing. Although people aren't used to seeing that as far as someone being on their back and using their legs, but it's a very legit technique. Your leg is pushing up against the carotid on one side, while their own arm is on the other side, sort of pushing the other side of the neck for you. So it is a choke. It's not dudes trying to scissor each other's, but it does look a little sus. I'm not gonna lie, it does look a little sus. So I can see why people look at it and are sort of, I guess, put off by it. Obviously, for me, someone that I know what I'm looking at, I'm like, this is really cool. Like the fact that he's in these positions and fighting for these positions so early on, when jujitsu is still this hidden art. I found it really cool. And eventually, Jason Deluca ends up sort of lifting himself up from that triangle position and ended up in a mounted triangle, which is just all types of terrible. If you want another example of this, you could look at Damian Maya against Chael Sonnen. Just a brutal position where you're on top of them. You have your leg basically over their neck on one side, and your entire body weight on top of them. So your leg, you're basically sitting on their neck, um, and just started landing punches from that position. And obviously, that's what ended up leading Scott Baker to tap. But this one, in my opinion, this is a fight of the night contender. Like this fight was fun. Definitely check this one out. There was a lot of moments where there was some lulls because now we're stuck in this transition, whether it be attacking a triangle or attacking a rear naked for Scott Baker. But that's just moments of excitement for me because you're as close as you can be to getting the finish. I'm looking at these small intricate details and seeing, does he actually have the choke? Like, is he almost there? And like I said, Deluca was almost there a couple times before this point, and then the way he capped off the finish was really sweet. So once again, just I was overall very impressed by these early performances, and really looking forward to the matchups later on, and just sort of thinking like, this guy is gonna face this, like that's gonna be crazy, like because you obviously see the way they performed in these previous fights, and you're just interested. Um, so that was a fun one. Final preliminary bout. This one was actually featured on the main card, which was cool, because the main card was where I was able to catch just the rest of the event all in once. So I didn't have to search up the individual fights, which I like doing just because it's more of an event feel where you're kind of watching it as it played out. And you get to see the backstage stuff. You get to see the promos that they throw up, which are always hilarious, always sort of real primitive, like they're throwing kicks and punches in a like ring where they're training. And they're just like doing these things, preparing, um not to fight, but like just getting warmed up and just saying cringe things. So it's always funny to watch, in my opinion. Sorry, I'm just trying to get comfortable here. But this eighth fight between Hoist Gracie and Minoki Ishihara was very fun for me. Obviously, you got the returning champ making his debut in UFC 2, coming up against someone who, obviously, the first Asian fighter, if I'm remembering correctly, um, between the first two events. And they're billing him up to be this extremely hard striker. Um, and I didn't you unfortunately didn't really get to see much of that. He was actually the smallest guy in the entire competition. And that's always interesting when literally Hoist's lore is wrapped up in the fact that he is a very small guy compared to a lot of these people that he's being pitted up against. But in this one, he had the height advantage and the size advantage, and it showed. I think Minoki was trying to land some intercepting shots. He actually did some really good leg kicks that did land, and I don't say they had an effect, but as far as like a visual, like, oh, he took that bad, like, no, there wasn't any hard strikes, but just cool to see guys mixing it up in a way that would be applauded today. um but eventually Hoist sort of goes through this Gracie stomp technique, and then eventually ends up getting a takedown. Hoist is, whenever he shoots, like, it's quick, which I find interesting because people always talk about how jujitsu guys don't have good wrestling. But just at the time, I'm sure these guys didn't feel anything like this before coming into these events. So He got a slick takedown, went straight into side, and then went side control, and then went straight into mount from there. Um, and this is a very prolonged fight, I will admit. This one went 5 minutes, 5 minutes and 8 seconds. And it was kind of hard to see what Hoist was working for. Because he was in side control. Like it looked almost like it was listed as a lapel choke, but it kind of looked like a rear naked choke with no hooks, and then it eventually started to look like an arm bar. So even the commentators were a little confused in the moment, but then looking back on it, you see he's actually using the gi of Minoki against him by holding it as a fulcrum sort of. And you even heard my voice right there just change just when I pulled my collar, but using his collar to choke him out, which you see in gi competitions a lot. Like that's not a rare move, but obviously at this point just cool to see, because even for me watching it, I was like, wait, what was that? Like I had to look at it a couple times to catch that it was a lapel choke, because it looked very weird. I'm not gonna lie, it looked a little strange. So check that one out if you want. Just once again, these are relics in time, and looking back at these fights, it's kind of crazy because, like I said, a lot of the reactions you expect to see isn't what you end up seeing, and a lot of the resistance just isn't there, especially in fights like that. So Hoist Gracie just ends up getting what amounts to be a pretty easy win at 5 minutes and 8 seconds, which was, not mistaken, his longest fight. Yeah, his longest fight up to this point. Which is interesting to see him last that long. Once again, with the way it finished, it's not as if you felt like it was a competitive fight. Um, but it was definitely one-sided, but he lasted longer than anyone had up until that point. So that was of note. You take a sip real quick as we're rounding third base here. All right. The first quarterfinal bout right here. The hometown favorite, Patrick Smith, looking lethal against Scott Morris. Man, this one was crazy. This one really, the commentary really added to this one as far as how it felt. Um, so Patrick Smith comes out and Scott Morris just runs at him. Like as soon as the fight starts, he's running straight across the cage, and Patrick Smith just stops and just sort of looks at him, and the commentators say like, he didn't even like move, like literally he just watched his approach, and then eventually when he came in, Scott Morris sort of threw a sidekick, and then they ended up sort of clinched up, and Scott Morris is pushing Patrick Smith up against the fence at this point. And as soon as they sort of hit the fence, you see the fence has some give to it, because as soon as they hit the fence, obviously Patrick Smith has his back to the fence. You see a bounce, like he hits the fence and bounces off, and then immediately ends up in mount, which I had to watch it back a couple times because it didn't make sense to me. Like you don't really see stuff like that. And you'll hear me say that a lot. You got to drink every time you hear me say that. But you don't really see stuff like that today. You see sometimes people use it, and Randy Couture talks about this a lot. Just sort of, the cage does have bounce, but I feel like I haven't seen it to that level where literally you see both guys are affected by the bounce of the cage, and then immediately he ends up in an advantageous position because of it. It was just kind of weird the way he fell, but he ended up landing in full mount, and you see Scott Morris is trying to defend by putting his feet into Patrick Smith's armpit areas on both sides and sort of trying to kick him away. But man, it didn't do anything. And Patrick Smith just starts raining punches like really fast on his chin and just bouncing his head off the canvas. Like you saw just with the punches that he was out. Like his mouthpiece came out. And you see him obviously stop moving, and now he's just getting hit. And then Patrick Smith just unleashed some elbows, man. I got my eyes closed just thinking about it because it was rough. Like this was one of the moments that I felt like, fuck, man. Like, I wish they could have stopped this, because this should have been stopped 9, 10, what felt like 15 seconds way too late, where this guy's already out and just getting bombed on, with fast, precise strikes that you have nowhere to go because your head is pressed up against the canvas. Just a bad spot to be in. And you see moments like this now where it's sort of a bang bang play, like there are in baseball, where they're throwing it to first and is really, really close as far as how the ball gets into the catcher's glove and the runner is stepping on the base. They call that a bang bang play. There's a lot of these bang bang plays in mixed martial arts where there's someone like this bombing on somebody, and you see they're landing these shots, but there's a real give and take there where the ref has to decide, are they in a position where they can't continue, or are they trying to defend or trying to get themselves in a better position? Because you don't necessarily have to be defending effectively. Like, it doesn't say, that's not in the rules, but you have to be defending yourself. Like, it doesn't matter if you're being hit to a certain extent, obviously, but it doesn't matter if you're being hit so long as you're showing the ref that you're in the contest still, that you're trying to change position, etc. And there was none of that. He was just getting bombed on, dude, and it was hard to watch. And it ended with elbows that split Scott Morris open, and then you see him sort of, he's out, like way out at this point, and he sort of turns to his side and is just covering up, instinctively. Like, you see his arm comes up like as a fencing response. Shout out to shout out to Dan Hardy for giving me that word to be in my repertoire. But that's basically when your brain is shut off and it's trying to prevent further damage, but it's not a conscious movement, as far as you're not deciding to do that, but your body's doing it to preserve itself. And it was just rough to see. Patrick Smith literally got up and stopped the fight himself, because at that point John McCarthy's watching it, but he can't stop it according to the rules, and he's waiting for the towel to come in. So we're all sitting here like, dude, call the cops. Like, this guy is finito, bro. Like, he is being sent into the dirt. So it was just bad. And you see eventually Scott Morris is trying to get up, and he is just wrecked, man. Like, once again, he's tumbling all over the place. He's leaking. It was a hard one to watch. This one really kicked it in for me, that I'm like, yeah, fuck this no referee stoppage thing. Like, this is just unnecessary brain damage, literally. Um, and one could argue that all brain damage is unnecessary, especially in this sport, but just insane, insane. Which is the argument against it. A lot of people feel that you shouldn't be doing these things to people, especially obviously in any other setting than this. It is 100% things you shouldn't be doing according to law, but where there is a certain necessary amount as far as keeping yourself in the competition. And that, once again, there was just none of that. It was just a one-way traffic and a brutal, here we go with that buzzword again, but just scary finish, a scary finish that makes you worried about his next opponent. and and the commentators were saying that too. So once again, just sort of aura of Patrick Smith. He's in his hometown. Everyone's always cheering for him no matter what. And he gets two finishes relatively quick, one by submission, and then another just putting this guy completely out. And you heard Jim Brown's reaction to this one. He was like, this is intense, folks. And this was after he's already been bombed on, obviously, and finally the fight got stopped. He's like, this is intense. Like, I'm sure everyone there felt that shit, because even when their guy won, they were screaming and really vouching for him. But even towards the end, you sort of hear like a collective oh shit before they start cheering him on, obviously to celebrate his win. But whew, that was a fun one, man. That was, I know, it sounds a little weird celebrating um these acts of violence, but literally just a beautiful finish there by Patrick Smith. It's what we come here to see, man. So anyway, and it sounds so cringe, but anyway, the second quarterfinal bout was between Johnny Rhodes and Fred Edish. So this was actually supposed to be Frank Hamacher, the guy with the singlet I was talking about earlier, but he ended up getting injured. They never specified on the broadcast what it was, but he ended up getting injured and not competing. So this was an alternate, and you saw it was an alternate dude. Johnny Rhodes was the guy that was in the longest fight in UFC history up to this point against Dave Levicki. Remember, I was saying he was holding the cage, all that stuff. Man, Fred Edish was just not prepared at all. Like I honestly feel, and I gave this some thought before went live because I didn't want to be rude. Like I don't want to be disparaging of these guys because at the end of the day, they competed and a lot at this time a lot of people were. So anyway, I always try to come to this from a place of respect. So I hope this doesn't come off as a like me bashing on him, but I really feel like he could have fought anybody that's competed up to this point and he would have lost. Like that's just the way I felt watching him fight. He looked very timid. He was trying to land leg strikes. It, this fight reminded me of when you're playing Fight Night or you're playing the UFC fight game. I don't know if any of you guys have, but and you're facing someone who's cheese and they just try to do the same moves over and over again. That was Fred Edish trying to land leg kicks. Like they were landing, but they weren't doing much. But he was constantly throwing them. Even when I'll get to that later, but literally, if Johnny Rhodes was that character, like the character when when you're in fighting games that you see their health and like when they're beat up, like that certain spot turns red. Like my boy Johnny Rhodes' legs was red because he was getting kicked a lot by Fred Edish, but it didn't feel as if he was prepared to do anything else. Like it felt very much so like those kicks were last ditch effort to keep the opponent away from him. Um, it was strange. It was strange. He started with the karate hands and trying to like, but there was never a hard strike thrown on his part. There was a lot of good counter right hands by Johnny Rhodes. I've been really impressed by Johnny Rhodes all round abilities. He was able to tough out a really long, extended fight in the first fight of the night. And this one, he landed some slick counter right hands against somebody who was coming forward against them. That I was like, those look good. Like those are those are good shots. Like those are not something that wouldn't work today. Like not that I'm saying those were anywhere near the level of today, but you know what I mean. Like it didn't look out of place. They look like functionable strikes, which for a lot of these people still at this point, you don't really see that. So that was really cool to see. Eventually, this one was crazy, man. Johnny Rhodes just landing big shots, and eventually you see Fred Edish sort of start covering up on the ground, and then eventually Johnny Rhodes sort of stood up and is looking down at Fred Edish while Edish is just kicking him in the knee, like with side kicks. But he's on the floor just looking at him. And he's bleeding from his eye. And at one point, he's like pointing to his own eye. Like, I don't know if he was talking to the ref, like saying, bro, like, stop this shit. Like, do you see this? But literally, he's like pointing to his eye, like as if we don't know that he's leaking. Um, and he's like, not even trying to get up, just kicking his leg from the bottom position. Like, with all due respect, at that point, I don't really feel like you're trying to win. Like you're just trying to keep the guy off you to some extent. At that point, I feel like if anyone showed that sort of body language in a fight today, it would immediately be stopped. It was just another drawn out beating that was kind of tough to watch, where you see this guy leaking and Johnny Rhodes is just bombing him. And eventually he ended up finishing the fight by tossing his legs to the side and landing a big right hand that made Fred Edish really like turtle up and sort of shield and just try to go to his back. And this was really interesting. Johnny Rhodes actually went and took back mount. So he had both hooks in that choking position, basically, for the rear naked choke. And just literally, I can't remember a time that I saw this. Like, I've seen it in half guard, but he literally, you see him take his leg out from the having the hooks in and just go to the complete opposite side. So now he's like on side control turtle. Um, not even, and like just relinquish the position entirely to hit him more. Like, you never see, like, nobody will ever do that. You could, the leverage you have from that position, even for strikes, is a lot. Like, you can do a lot of damage from back mount if you're landing your shots precisely and you're picking your shots well. Literally, he just gave up that position and was like, nah, I'm gonna hold you down from side control. This shit feels weird. I mean, this feels like I'm not gonna fall. Let me stay on this and basically pound you out until the referee decides to stop it. Eventually, his corner, well, his corner actually was real close to throwing it in a couple times, but eventually Johnny Rhodes ended up locking in a bulldog choke. Um, and I give it to Fred Edish, man. Although he did not look equipped technique wise to compete, he did not falter with it as far as his heart. Like, I know I said it doesn't look like you're trying to win, but he never went out there trying to lose. Like, he was fighting the bulldog choke. Like, usually you see, even sometimes today, you see in fights where people are hurt on the feet and then they end up in a choking position later on in the fight and they're sort of quick to give in. Like, nah. Fred Edish was trying to fight out of the bulldog choke, but he just wasn't able to. And you could see Johnny Rhodes didn't really know how to like finish with the choke. Like, the reason why it was a bulldog choke was because it was basically a rear naked choke with no hooks in, which is very schoolyard technique. And it ended up being sort of on the side. So that's why I ended up calling it a bulldog choke. But Johnny Rhodes wins at 3 minutes and 7 seconds in a fight that he let go of back mount to land ground and pound from Turtle. I was like, I need to write that down because that'll never happen today. It was just strange. But Johnny Rhodes with another big win. All right. So next up, we've got Hemko Pardo taking on Orlando Veet. Once again, this is grappling versus kickboxing. I was excited for this one. And the commentators were too, man. They was all on that Orlando Veet train. They're like, I don't see how Hemko survives this. And it was mad funny because this fight went to the ground relatively quickly. Um, and it was Hemko Pardo with that same arm drag that he got in the first fight that led him to get that takedown. And literally, they're in this position where, how do I explain this? Hemko has his arm, and he's kind of in a position where he could eventually attack Kimura, but not yet. Like, it's a scarf hold position once again, but he's holding the arm. Like, the arm is sort of isolated, and that's how he's able to hold the leverage so that Orlando Veet doesn't pop out the backside like he did against Lucarelli. So he's holding his arm to prevent him from sort of popping out the backside. And you see Orlando Veet trying to kick and game, like, buck and gain momentum in order to do just that, to escape from the backside of the choke, or not the choke, but the position underneath where he was holding his arm. And Hemko didn't allow it. He held, like, um, top position very well, using his opponent's arm to sort of keep him stuck in that spot. And then eventually you see him realize, like, he's literally on top. This was insane to me. This was one of the ones that I circled. I was like, this was, if there's any fight you want to see, this is like top five, top three, in my opinion, of fights that you got to check back. I would say Patrick Smith, Scott Morris, this one, Hemko Pardo versus Orlando V, and another one I'm gonna get to later. But definitely check this one out. This was wild. Hemko sort of looks at him and you see him realize, like, oh shit, I could hit you. and he's looking down on him just like I'm looking right here, and he just starts landing elbows like straight down on his head. And the first two, you could tell once again that he was knocked out bad. Um, because every time the elbow hit, his entire body like jumped with it, which is just it's so scary. Not scary. It's a exaggerated word, but it just makes you cringe almost because you know the effects of stuff like that where, like I said, his head has no movement. He's up against the canvas. He's just getting bounced off the canvas, and his whole body's going with it. Like it's just an ominous feeling you get from watching that knockout. I'm not gonna lie. But he wins from KO by elbows from scarf hold. And literally in the post fight interview, he says, I didn't expect to win that. Like Orlando V is a tough opponent. And you never really hear stuff like that. Like he was very honest and very sort of humble in this event and saying like, not that he was surprised to be there, but these guys are tough and I didn't expect to win, but I did everything I could to try to win, and I did, which is badass. I respect that a lot. But he ended up getting that KO in 30 seconds once again. So just another 30-second KO in these quarterfinals that just left my jaw drop. I'm like, holy shit, I want to see all these guys fight each other. Like, I don't even, at this point, all these matchups are interesting because you've seen these guys win and now they're winning again. So it's just like you feel what we're building towards here, which is always exciting in these tournament formats. So next up, we're getting towards the end here. Try to get comfortable again. We are getting towards the end here. So we've got Hoist Gracie coming up against Jason Deluca. Jiu-Jitsu against Kung Fu. This one was, once again, I was looking forward to this one because of how Jason Deluca, what's the word? How he represented himself in the first fight within the grappling specifically. He did a very formidable job of using his jiu-jitsu offensively to attack submissions against his opponent. So I was like, I wonder how that's going to work. But they clinched up really early, and eventually Hoist did what Hoist does, man. He just got the takedown. Excuse me. Got the takedown and ended up sort of in a mount position, but you see Jason Deluca tries to sort of throw him off of him, and that's something that's always taught in schools. Like you don't do that. You don't even if you're being like, even if you're mounted and you're looking up at your opponent, you don't push up or try to bench press your opponent off you, because if you do, you're extending your arm and basically giving them your arm for a submission. And that's exactly what Hoist did. He took advantage as soon as he felt him pushing off and immediately threw himself back in order to attack that arm. You sort of see it was sort of reminiscent. I don't know if I hope you guys know this one, but Ronda Rousey versus Kat Zingano, where she has that arm already locked up before she even realizes it, and she sort of looks. And she goes, "Oh yeah, I got an arm bar," and then bridges her hips, and then you see the arm fully extend. Um, this one was a little more cultivated on Hoist Gracie's part. You see him like flip and react once he gets pushed in that way, and then immediately turns against the cage in order to have the leverage to submit Jason Deluca. And this was hard to watch too because you see him tap multiple times before the ref stops it. um Definitely needed a quicker stoppage there from John McCarthy. He had to tap to this submission like 4 times. And with the arm lock, you don't want to be in that position because usually when you tap already, like when you're brought to tap from a submission like that, you're already at the point where your elbow is compromised enough that your arm could break. Like you're usually when you're brought to tap in those positions, you feel it already and you stop it before it gets to that point. So I'm sure that there had to be some damage there to DeLuca's elbow or maybe the arm. I didn't look that up. I should have, but just a savage, savage submission there by Hoist Gracie. And at a minute and 1 second, interestingly enough. So now I should have wish I had some sort of like graphic or some sort of sound effect. We got the semifinals, the semifinal matches coming up. And man, I was excited for this. I couldn't wait. I couldn't wait to see these guys fight. So the fact that we're at the final four of this tournament now, I'm just juiced. I was excited, ready to watch these fights. You got Patrick Smith, the hometown hero, coming up against Johnny Rhodes, who's been in some absolute barn burners tonight. Both of his fights were prolonged to an extent and ended in spectacular fashion. So um just super excited for this fight. Both guys ended up sort of coming out very strong against one another, and I really like that. I think there was a lot of technical moments in this fight. You see Patrick Smith starting out with some leg kicks from outside that were very telegraphed, that he was not setting up with punches, just sort of blindly throwing leg kicks. And you see Johnny Rhodes. Johnny Rhodes got a right hand on him, man, and that commentary is quick to jump on it too. Johnny Rhodes' right hand does not mess around, and it was really cool to see a very modern counter to the leg kicks. As far as Patrick Smith threw a blind leg kick, I say blind because it wasn't set up with punches or anything beforehand. So he's just throwing a kick raw. I mean, you see, that's a really exaggerated movement. Like that's a lot to pick up on for an opponent. So you see him throw that kick, and then Johnny Rhodes takes the kick, but then throws that overhand right and lands big against Patrick Smith, which is someone up to this point has looked unstoppable. Hasn't gotten rocked or anything up to this point. And Patrick Smith got hit with some big right hands here, and in a very short fight, he got hit a couple times hard. That I was like, man, those are good. Those are good shots. Like I'm surprised, not that he didn't react, but that nothing came of it. And eventually, they ended up in a position where they were up against the cage, and again, you see Patrick Smith sort of start attacking that neck once Johnny Rhodes drops his head, and he's attacking the guillotine. And I guess it was an arm in. I couldn't exactly tell from the angle that I saw, but Johnny Rhodes actually wasn't able to tap because his arm was stuck. So he ended up tapping with his leg. Like you see him stomping on the floor, which is a very interesting visual, um, especially in a fight like this. But man, that this was a fun one. Like I feel like this is also a potential fight of the night because there actually was moments in this fight. Once again, there wasn't a lot of fights like this tonight at all. Um, so I like this one a lot. Although it was a very quick fight, it ended at a minute and 7 due to guillotine. Um, it was really cool to see it, and it was cool afterwards. They sort of show their respect. But Patrick Smith is larger than life, man. And and all the interviews, he's just cocky as hell. Like they're like, "Oh, another fight that wasn't too long. It's only been a minute. Like, how do you feel?" He's like, "Oh, well, I need some better opponents." Like, and I'm like, "Damn, bro! Like, you was just showing him respect, and now you just bumping yourself up." I love it though. I love it though. Once again, it adds to the story. But that was a really fun semifinal bout, and it brings us to the second semifinal bout: Hoist Gracie versus Hemko Pardo, coming off a brutal knockout. I'm thinking like, man, if Hemko could find himself in a good position here, like who knows? Like he could land some big shots and potentially hurt Hoist. Like I was really looking forward to this one, especially because the size. Like Hemko is much bigger than Hoist, but this one gave me none of that. It gave me none of that. This one ended pretty quick, man. Hoist Gracie went immediately to attack sort of a body lock from the back. Um, and it looked like he was definitely um, getting some leverage for a takedown, but they were spinning around and eventually you see Hemko sort of concede I'm gonna go down, so let me just try like to get a throw in to try to get momentum and end up on top. And he ended up not doing that. Hemko Hoist ended up in a in a back mount position and immediately starts attacking what I thought would be a rear naked, but he turned it into a lapel choke and finished it at a minute and 31. This one was not competitive, man. It was not competitive. I thought it would be, and it was not at all. Once he got the takedown, he just worked through the positions, worked to the back, and then used his opponent's own gi to choke him out again. Second time tonight, he landed that same submission, third submission of the night for Hoist up to this point. Just crazy. Um, People celebrate now. For example, Lupi Godinez this past couple weeks, she's fought on two back-to-back UFC cards, 7 days apart from each other, and that celebrated, the quickest turnaround between bouts. Man, this guy fought 4 times in one night in a tournament. Like crazy. Narrowed down 16 people to one. But that brings us to the final, man. Oof. Hoist Gracie up against Patrick Smith, the hometown hero. This one was electric, man. Both guys got cheered on really big, and I was excited as hell. I was happy to watch this one. Whew, excuse me. But Hoist Gracie does what Hoist Gracie does, man. He, after a little bit of moments on the feed where you see Patrick Smith trying to sort of fake him out, trying to do certain things to get him reacting, eventually ends up in a really bad spot, being taken down. Um, Hoist starts working towards the mount, and then you see, man, not close at all again. Like the entire fight, the fact that Patrick Smith won all his fights leading up to this point, 3 fights in impressive fashion, like you're feeling it, like, man, this could be something. Like, nah, there's levels to this, and Hoist Gracie is just on another level, man. He just attacked from that position and attacked until he ended up in mount, started landing punches, not even necessarily trying to go for a choke yet, just softening him up, hoping that he gave him the choke. And instead of giving him the choke, Hoist Gracie starts sort of wrapping up the only arm that's there to defend from Patrick Smith. He's wrapping up the arm and then using the other hand to hit. Whew, sorry guys. And that was all. That was all she wrote, man. The corner threw the towel after Patrick Smith tapped 2 strikes with a minute or so into the round. Literally, let me check. I'm sorry, as I could give you the actual number. It is a minute and 17 seconds into the round. Just domination by Hoist, especially in times where I pointed to certain moments where I thought could have been competitive. No, Hoist just dominated, man, for 2 events in a row, and the fact that you won 2 tournaments now, tournaments that if you add it all up, it's 24 guys, 24 different men that are trying to compete to become the champ, and now you've done it twice, multiple times in one night. You've been through tournaments and came out to champ. Like that's impressive. Like, I don't care who you was fighting, I don't care the level. These guys was getting finishes earlier in the night and hurting people. Like, Patrick Smith was hurting people. Like, he came back with a vengeance in UFC 2, and that was really cool to see the storyline. The the growth of Patrick Smith, the character. But this is a really fun one, man. Thank you guys for tuning in. It was the longest one so far, and I'm hoping not many of this long, man. 15 fights. That's a lot of fights. Like, there's not cards like that often today. Like, they 12 fights is a lot of fights for UFC cards now. So 15 was just, it was just a lot. You can see it was a lot to talk about. But I just had a blast with you guys. I hope you guys are having as much fun with me as I am with you guys. I'm just loving watching these fights, experiencing the history of the sport, and then sort of just looking back at it and seeing what I could notice, what I could point out, and just seeing these things that help me enjoy the fight. I want to share it to you guys and hopefully help you guys enjoy it too. So thank you so much for tuning in. Hope you guys enjoyed. Please check out these fights. Show these guys the due that they deserve, and follow us on all handles, man. My Twitter is Negron MMA. My Instagram is Chris Negron _ and follow the brand OTS Media Co. on all platforms. That's how you're getting this podcast. You're getting this feed. You can either get it on the MMA Archive feed or just straight through OTS Media, which I recommend. They got a lot of good stuff sports wise coming out of there, and I'm honored to be a part of it, man. So really check out the stuff that we got going on at OTS. Thank you so much for tuning in, and look forward to the next episode of the MMA Archive. Peace.